Welcome everybody to our second Power Lunch, which is being hosted by Idea Growth and the help and expertise of GeoComply, who's been super helpful with organizing all three of our Power Lunches this week. Yesterday was a great Power Lunch that was moderated by John Pappas, and eventually you will be able to listen to that if you missed that, since it's being recorded like this session as well. And if you want a copy or a link of this seminar, you'll be able to get that as well. Please feel free to email me, and I'll be happy to get that to you as soon as it's available. A couple housekeeping items. CLE is available for lawyers that are out there. So as you can see in the bottom left screen that you should have access to, although if you're calling in by phone, it says that CLE is available in Georgia, Ohio, and New Jersey and New York. So the verification code for Georgia and Ohio is Idea Growth PLL1, and our understanding is that Ohio has reciprocity with New York and New Jersey, and you should be able to get credit for all three of our lunches as well. I want to thank Brian and Tracy in my office and Heather for coordinating the various CLE requirements in those 4 jurisdictions. The next seminar we'll talk a little bit more about at the end of today's session, but it's tomorrow, same time, Friday from noon to 1, and it will be a great panel on responsible gaming and problem gaming, which will be moderated by my co-founder of IDEA, Jeremy Klein. So we're looking forward to great participation tomorrow as well. The Idea Growth, if you're not familiar with it, the website is ideagrowth.org, and you can register there for daily clips, which would be emails that you'll get each morning that aggregate on a state-by-state basis ongoings in the gaming and sports betting world. And I think they're very helpful, very easy way each morning to see what's happened the night before and what's being reported by the major media outlets on sports betting and gaming. In addition, there's several different papers and analyses that you can find on the Idea Growth webinar, the Idea Growth website, which go to issues that are important to the mobile betting industry. And you can also see who our members are on this next page. So Vivian, if you could go to the next page. Today's panel is going to feature some great speakers that we're all lucky to have. Michael Daly at Catena Media, who is a proud IDEA member. Ilkam Hinser, who's the new Chief Legal Officer and Executive Vice President at Hard Rock, who we're really happy to have today. And Chris Soriano, who is the Head of Compliance for Penn, which has been in the newspaper a lot with their new launch of their sports product. And of course, both Hard Rock and Penn are multi-state casinos that operate in a lot of different states and have been in this space for quite a while. Our IDEA members consist of all sorts of different players in this vertical, which consist of both casino and sports and poker, as well as vendors and suppliers in the payments world and in the data world, as well as the data security world that support the industry. And Catena Media is one of our earliest members, which of course is the leading member of in the media space related to gaming and sports betting. And I will let Michael introduce himself when we get to our first question, and each of the speakers can, of course, introduce themselves to the extent that you don't know them. So just going to the first slide. Just to remind everyone, you do have a chat function, which is in your right-hand window. And there's just about 100 of you on now, and feel free to ask questions at any time. Happy to answer those questions as they come along, or we can answer those questions at the end of the session. We did have some questions that were submitted during registration, which we will try to get to right away. And also, again, anything on CLE or the CLE course material, please look at your chat log for a link for that information. Today's topic is about licensing, and really the main topic is to think about, now you have your license, and now what are some risks that can impact the license that you're holding. A license in the gaming world is critical because without the license, obviously you can't operate in the regulated jurisdiction that you're in that issued the license. Licenses traditionally have been held by land-based casinos like Hard Rock and Penn. And as states have decided to legalize interactive gaming, casino, poker, as well as sports, online companies have entered the licensing regime as well. So land-based casinos have lived with licensing regimes and licensing compliance for a long time since their existence. The online world is somewhat new to the world of compliance when it comes to licensing, because the world of regulated gaming online, both from casino and poker as well as sports, is relatively new. New Jersey has, of course, been around the longest with full suite of online gaming games, and other states have allowed poker as well. But even that is just a little over 6 years old, so not a lot of time and experience with the online world. So we've turned to 3 experts in both the land-based world and the media world who have held several different positions and have really unique backgrounds as well as current positions that are super helpful to this topic. So we're going to go through issues of traditional areas where licenses can essentially become an issue for a regulator. So what kind of conduct leads to that type of situation? And then we'll go on to some untraditional areas, so sort of new areas that are relevant both on the retail and online level. And then we'll go and discuss some related issues as well as concerns around compliance generally inside the gaming world, and then also compliance issues that have arisen recently in the news in the UK and lessons that that we might have to learn from what's going on over there. Again, anytime anyone would like to submit a question, please do that in your chat, and we'll get to it as soon as possible. Mike, if you could just introduce yourself and as well as answer the following question. I wanted to ask you, one of our questions that had been submitted was around the process of getting a license and the process of obtaining the license. And I want to ask each of you, but starting with you, Michael, first. You were around day one, and you've been through the process through some of other positions you've held, but what was it like for an organization like Catena Media, which was essentially a foreign company, not in the regulated space of the United States? On day one, what was it like for an organization to confront the kind of mountain of paper and other issues that arise around licensing?
Thanks, Jeff. This is Michael Daly. I'm the Vice President of Catena Media for North America. As Jeff said, we're the largest affiliate in the online gambling and betting space in North America and one of the largest in the world. So yeah, Jeff, the online or the licensing process for an online company is different. It's different for a particular European company. You know, in the US, having been with land-based vendors, et cetera, and companies like Hard Rock and Penn know this well. It's in the DNA. This is just part of how we operate. For a company coming across into the space, in the online space, it is an entirely different animal than any level of compliance they have dealt with overseas up until probably very recently in some markets. So the process is, it's completely invasive in terms of the amount of questions and depth that they go on, not just the company, but the individuals who are going to be the key license holders or just major stakeholders, down to your sales team who are going to be representing you in that state or that jurisdiction. So it goes into your financial backgrounds, in some cases going back years or all the way back to your finishing of high school. And then it's a long and lengthy process of interviewing. And you know, companies in the US are probably used to saying we have an interim license or temporary license, and that's different for the operators as well in my space coming in, and for my company, where you know, we have to make sure we say that's an interim license, because while we may have licenses of some sort in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Indiana, Colorado, et cetera, most of those tend to be interim for a long period of time as the regulators catch up on the in-depth process and go back through and do the in-person interviews, which is made even more interesting now during COVID times. So it was an overwhelming process, and every state is different, where they use some similar paperwork, but each state has its own process, and you have to make sure you adhere to that. And really pay attention to where the T's get crossed and the I's get dotted.
Thank you, Michael. Ilkham, if you could also just introduce yourself in answering the question. I know previously you were an attorney advising a lot of different companies in Canada and North America. What were some of, if you had to like advise a client about what a regulator is trying to do with these applications, what are they trying to determine? How would you advise that, that client? What's the goal of what the regulator is trying to do with this massive amount of overwhelming paperwork that Michael just talked about?
Thanks, Jeff. Yes, I'm currently the EVP and Chief Legal Officer of Hard Rock International, and I have, as you pointed out, had some experience on the private practice side of the aisle, so to speak, and that did open my eyes up to a lot of international clients and entities either trying to get into the US or Canada or dabbling in other parts of the world, so to speak. And it's been a very interesting transition for me coming from Canada to also now plug into the wonderful and wacky world of the American landscape, call it, now that I live down here as well. It's been fascinating. As someone who has had the fortune of being able to have this scope of international experience, I can say I think the most obvious comment that I would make would be most folks getting into this kind of licensing pursuit do appreciate that regulators are almost always on first principles concerned with things like acts of wrongdoing, avoiding introducing into the industry fraud, issues of moral turpitude, illegal gambling, just the traditional concerns that one would have as a regulator from a compliance perspective and maintaining the integrity of the industry. So none of that is foreign to anyone that I've dealt with or introduced into the online space, certainly in the US. That being said, I think the aspect that ends up being a little bit surprising is, as Michael pointed out, maybe the degree of invasiveness, not that it's necessarily far removed from some of the land-based approaches, but the fact that online gaming is essentially the implementation of basically what a technology company needs to do to succeed in an industry that is trying to still figure out what the industry needs to be based on first principles of originally being bound to land-based concepts. So when someone's coming into the online licensing process, I think some things are incredibly confusing as to, well, why do they need this? Why do they need that? I get that they're trying to prevent and avoid issues of wrongdoing and protect the integrity of the industry, integrity of the players involved and the stakeholders involved. But why do they need this? Why do they need that? Ultimately, this is a technology, and this is obviously stating the obvious here, but a technology-driven industry, technology-driven space. Not that the land-based casinos are not, but this is almost entirely, again, the implementation of technology companies, procedures, policies, operational plans in an industry that isn't necessarily used to that degree of technology reliance. And so the way that I try to sort of distinguish the two is, well, just imagine you're a tech company and imagine all the things that go, like you're purely a tech company. Remove the gambling aspect of it for a moment from the equation. And imagine all the things that can go wrong from a technology perspective. Look at the obvious tech companies in your daily life. Look at your telecommunications providers. Look at Google. Look at Apple. Look at the iPhone that you use on a daily basis, and imagine all the issues that can arise that can open the door to integrity issues or challenges that would be incredibly tough for the industry. And the regulator is trying to solve for those problems above and beyond traditional concepts of land-based compliance and licensing issues. So the technology focus, the absolute attempt to deal with very complicated convergence of constant changing technology and regulatory concepts does not come naturally to some people, and does not come naturally to the willingness in some cases, or desire to participate with a regulator with full enthusiasm on being suitable for licensing. It's a little easier to be able to say, well, you know, I've been licensed in this jurisdiction, that jurisdiction, and I'm a good guy, I'm a good actor, and here's my history. But it's a little different to bring into the equation, well, it's not just about that. It's about what can go wrong from a technology perspective. It's all the things that you have to consider and overlay, build into your DNA again, not just from an integrity perspective, from a traditional wrongdoing perspective, but a technical integrity perspective. All the exposures a tech company has to, from data management to anything related to AML, just the protection of data itself, personal information, dealing with a constant deluge of technological change. All that is trying to be dealt with by the regulator in a constantly evolving world. And some of them are not that experienced with it, and they will figure it out over time. But if you look at it from that perspective, this is incredibly focused on the need to protect the tech vulnerabilities in the space. And I think almost in some cases I've seen a light bulb come on and say, okay, well, that's a different angle. I didn't think of myself as someone that needed to protect against those vulnerabilities in a licensing process. And that's been helpful to me historically in my advice to clients.
Thank you, Elcom. That's tremendously helpful in putting into context. Of course, this is very much a tech-heavy industry, and you know, with that comes along those concerns that you mentioned. Chris, if you could also just introduce yourself. I mean, Chris was a partner previously in a major law firm like Elcom, and is now head of compliance for a huge casino chain that has been in the land-based business for a while, and also has interactive casino, and is now launching a very exciting time for Penn, a new sports betting product, which is sure to be very popular. Chris, if you could just give a little bit of background on yourself, and also like Elcom, you know, thinking of a client who comes to you and thinks that online licensing for their business is just another bunch of applications, and now you're advising them on things like suitability and character and taxes. It would be great to get your insight into some of those prior conversations you had before you joined Penn, if you can.
Yeah, sure, Jeff. Thanks, and happy to work with you and the members of the panel today, and thank you everyone for joining us. As Jeff mentioned, I spent 16 years as outside counsel to a number of gaming companies when I was with the law firm of Duane Morris, LLP, in the gaming law practice group there. And in February 2020, I joined Penn National as Vice President Chief Compliance Officer, where I oversee the compliance function for the entire company. So when you look at how a company like Penn handles licensing, the point that was made earlier is it's in our DNA, and it really is. As someone who's been, as a company that's been an operator for so long in so many different jurisdictions, licensing to us is obviously a very high priority. Compliance is a very high priority, but we understand it and we know what needs to be done and why we have to do what it is we have to do. So while dealing with the licensing process is obviously it's time consuming, it's something that we do willingly and very well because of our experience with it. Now, turning to what you suggested earlier, Jeff, which is, say, a new entrant to the industry asking why do I have to do this and what's involved here? I had a similar spin and experience that Elcom has, and I would take it back to the beginning. When we talk about and remind clients and remind everyone coming into the space, put it in its historical context. When we look at state constitutions and when we look at state law, these state constitutions start from the premise that typically gambling is prohibited. I mean, if you look at the New Jersey state constitution, it starts with the premise that the legislature may not authorize any form of gambling. And then you have the amendments that have come over time that have these very limited, narrow expansions of gambling. So you put it in its context and you see that as a matter of public policy for so long, gambling has been something that public policy makers were afraid of. And when you look at the need to strictly regulate and strictly authorize, and you go back to what the Casino Control Act in New Jersey was trying to combat in 1976, if you look at the legislative history and everything that went into it, it was organized crime and this fear that the players will not trust the industry if there's any attempt for organized crime or opportunity for organized crime to infiltrate the industry. And a lot of the framework that was put in place then remains the framework that's in place today. And I would suggest that the reason why the investigations are so thorough and why the information required is so thorough is because people who are trying to sneak into the industry illicitly are not going to advertise the fact that they're trying to sneak into the industry illicitly. They're going to try to sneak in a covert way. So the need to assure the regulator that everyone is above board, I think, comes from the fact that there are many creative folks out there who try to find ways around things. And that necessarily requires a depth of investigation that perhaps we would not be used to. The other thing I think it's really important, Jeff, to remind clients of, and something I always found helpful, is our regulators in the US take their obligations and statutory requirements of confidentiality incredibly seriously. And while I realize that it is difficult to want to give a government agency one's tax returns, life history, et cetera, those of us on this who've been licensed know what it's like. And the, when you get, I get a question from my spouse every once in a while of, why do we have to answer this question or that question? I'm not, she'll say, I'm not employed in the gaming industry. Why do I have to do this? And I explain what it is we're trying to do. I think the real assurance and think that everyone can take a lot of confidence in is the very, very high premium that our regulators in the US put on confidentiality and on the protection of personal information. And I don't think there's any risk whatsoever of an individual or entity's personal information being leaked or misused by a gaming regulator who uses it for the purpose of evaluating the person's suitability, and then it's never released or otherwise exposed. I think that we take a lot of confidence as people who participate in the licensed industry in how seriously our regulators take that obligation. And again, I could not imagine a circumstance where something like that would be violated. So those considerations I would often go into my conversations with potential clients, and I found it to be effective.
Well, that's a tremendous overview. Super appreciate that perspective and that background. I think that that is a great way to have set the table on the topic of what are some areas that where people do get in trouble. And I should point out that, of course, losing a license is very, very rare. The fact that regulators have that authority, it's not lost on regulators that obviously it's only the rare case where an operator, after having spent all that time that Michael, Ilkham, and Chris just talked about on these applications and having their individuals qualified, it's obviously a rare circumstance where a regulator wants to, to pull a license, as they would say, and that happens rarely. And that's also because in a lot of cases, people are given an opportunity, if it's an individual, to also resign from an organization if that would assist. And there are others, types of settlements, of course, that you can reach and that's where compliance comes in and corrective behavior comes in. Before we go to the next slide, I just wanted to, just as a general thing, talk about the types of issues that can get regulators post-licensing to knock on your door or to call, and the types of traditional issues, I would say. I think taxes, there are circumstances where people might do something very simple like withdraw from a 401k, but and they don't consider that to be income, so they didn't disclose it on their application. But then as the investigation catches up with the applications and the disclosed income, there's mismatches on the applications. And every question that's asked is invasive, as Chris said. But in my experience, it's not one subject matter that gets necessarily people into trouble or gets investigations started. It's really the failure to disclose in the first instance, and that failure can be on an application, it could be on response to a question, and generally, I think that clients have reasons for why these failures were made, and sometimes there's some judgments being made about what does a regulator really need to see, and some of the issues that Chris mentioned about privacy and confidentiality, and that's why it's so important to understand that this information is not going to be released and should be approached and with full disclosure in mind. But I think that if we had to say, like, what was a typical traditional area aside from some sort of massive, criminal charge that you would expect a company to lose its license, or, significant misconduct at the executive level that, borders on criminal. I think it's really the failure to disclose and the failure to be fully honest with both the application process and follow-up requests from investigators. And I just leave it to the panel if anyone wants to comment on that particular issue, and, whether you agree or want to comment further on that.
I'll just say one thing on Jeff. I think you hit the nail on the head. It's transparency. I think that's one of the most important things, and it's one of the reasons as you get into the U.S. regulatory space, you really need a compliance officer in the organization, because things that don't seem, as you said, on the 401k or personal issues in your life that are not immediately in your mindset that you should be reporting to a regulator, those can often be the things that get you in trouble. I've seen in a prior company where a senior member of staff was required to leave the company because it jeopardized their licenses when something that happened in his personal life, he just didn't disclose. I don't know that it even came to mind, but regulators don't like secrets or concerns that we may be trying to hide things, as Christopher said, based on the histories out there. So, you have to be absolutely transparent, and you have to have someone like a compliance officer to bounce those things off internally. Is should this be reported? And better to state than not, because again, the danger of losing a license is also getting it back and the revenue impact, and then the domino effect, because losing a license is a reportable function to the next jurisdiction and to every jurisdiction, and that can cause a whole rash of issues.
Yes, exactly. And I just want to remind everyone that it's almost at the half hour, and if you'd like to submit any questions, feel free to do so. Vivian, we're going to go to the next slide because Michael set that up very nicely. And the next question is really, what are some of the unexpected ways? We talked about failing to disclose and taxes and misconduct and criminal indictments and issues that are somewhat a little more intuitive. In terms of unexpected ways, I don't know that these are not intuitive per se in the world we live in, but they might be in the land-based world. And Ilkham, I don't know if you or Chris, where exactly you were, but when the Steve Wynn situation kind of comes to mind as a situation, and just for our listeners, that's a situation where a major leading figure is accused of sexual harassment. And that's kind of almost a nice way of phrasing the allegations. And they come before the gaming board. And I think, some people are, at the time, I think, were like, wow, this seems really like expansive jurisdiction. Where does a regulator, come in to start investigating claims of sexual harassment? And it'd be great to get Ilkham, you and Chris's kind of reaction to that investigation when that first started, and how you reconciled the investigation and the nature of regulatory licensing.
Oh, thanks, Jeff. When that was happening, I was not with Hard Rock, but certainly was involved in examining it, looking at it, and advising some clients on it while I was back up in Canada. And we have here at Hard Rock, since I've joined, we have discussed it at length at the compliance committee level as well, the corporate compliance committee level. So it has certainly percolated into our reality, as I think it has into any gaming company's reality. It may have appeared to be a little unusual as you pointed out, as you stated a minute ago. But if you sort of think through it, and if you look at what the concept of licensing and suitability and regulatory oversight is supposed to be getting at, it does ultimately relate back to this whole concept of again, suitability. And if somehow it is in the public consciousness, if it is somehow from either a public policy perspective or the right thing to do perspective, something that maybe hasn't got the attention it deserves, and maybe it is now getting the attention that it deserves, it absolutely needs to be addressed. And what does that mean at a very practical level? Well, if allegations of harassment or sexual harassment or related matters had not been traditionally percolating up the chain from, let's say, a brick and mortar site to the local compliance committee, and then maybe a regional compliance committee, and then maybe the corporate headquarters compliance committee level historically. Well, now it would behoove us all to ensure that it is analyzed in the context of whether or not it should, in light of the fact that this is in the public consciousness, and it is something that gets to the very core of how integrity fits into the corporate culture and the suitability of the not only the individual involved vis-a-vis the operations perhaps, but also the cultural implications for the company itself. And as I think Michael pointed out as well, and obviously Penn and Chris are very much, this is part of their daily existence. All of our licenses are interconnected in one way or another, either formally or informally. All unsuitable situations really impact on the entirety of the reputation of the company. And maybe not, again, in a technical legal matter in some jurisdictions, maybe something that happens at a site level may not ultimately cause massive ripples at another level, but in most instances these days where everything is interconnected in one shape, way, or form, I think that's a risk nobody wants to take. And again, our corporate compliance committee at Hard Rock certainly has a very broad definition of what an unsuitable situation is. An unsuitable situation for us that we have to protect against is basically any event or circumstance that may have an adverse effect on the reputation of the company. And that's a massively all-encompassing, gigantic statement. Any event or circumstance that may have an adverse effect on the reputation of the company. Well, does that translate into the license disappearing or being pulled, what I like to call the nuclear option? Is a regulator likely to do that for a company at an entity level for the kind of situation that arose with the Steve Wynn situation? Maybe, maybe not. But at the end of the day, the reputation of the company and how the company deals with situations as they come up. And as I like to point out, that compliance is really about how you react to failures and gaps in systems and protocols and controls. It's more, that's when you prove whether or not you have a good compliance culture and good compliance protocol, as opposed to eradication of those gaps. Ideally, you do want to eradicate them, but your reaction is how you're judged most of the time. Not all the time, but most of the time by regulators. But to the extent that it impacts at all on your reputation in an adverse way, and therefore the very integrity of the company, the very brand that you have, the very nature of why regulators trust you or don't trust you, well, then it behooves you to be on top of the situation, build in protocols for reporting it up the chain, for addressing it, for putting in systems to mitigate this from happening again, hopefully in the future, or addressing it in the best possible way. And when this was again happening and I was in Canada, those conversations were being had very, very openly and robustly with every government agency I was dealing with as well, be it regulators or Crown oversight agencies in Canada. And I've certainly seen that here as well. So again, it's a long-winded way of saying, I think it's all interconnected. It all goes back to what it means to have an adverse impact on the integrity and reputation of the entire enterprise. And this kind of thing certainly may not be something traditionally thought of as something impacting on licensing, but my goodness, it certainly is today.
Well, I've heard Chris talk about culture of compliance as well, and I think any major organization that's, you know, a top organization in any industry has to see things exactly as you said them, Ilka, and that was very well said and not long-winded at all. Chris, when this happened, this situation happened, of course, it wasn't like the regulators, you know, got a claim of sexual harassment, although they could investigate a claim of sexual harassment. I'm sure regulators also know that, you know, sometimes people want to try and take advantage and get a regulator to issue a complaint about something because it helps establish civil liability. And of course, there's a lot of plaintiffs' lawyers out there looking to do things like that. And regulators don't like to be, you know, the initial investigating agency, although they can be. In this particular case, the investigation really was, again, back to failure to disclose and back to, you know, what Michael was saying about transparency. There was litigation going on and being settled, and it wasn't being, not only was it not being disclosed to the regulator, but on subsequent applications, questions were being left blank about prior litigation, and disclosures were not being made. How, you know, if you can answer this, but how does something like that happen in an organization where a license that's so critical to, you know, to a huge casino and can be impacted on failure to disclose? How do people rationalize to, you know, possibly omit that information and risk their license? How can they think that that's not going to be a big deal? And does it go to that culture? Is there a problem in the culture right off the bat of compliance? I know that's a lot of questions for you, Chris. Sorry.
No, that's great, Joe. You know, I appreciate the questions. I think they hit right on the points that we're trying to cover and build off of Ilkam's terrific answer. It is a culture type situation. If you look at, obviously what got the headlines in the Wynn scenario was the underlying conduct, the allegations of harassment. And if you read the details of those, there's no, we can't credibly say that those are anything other than reprehensible. Where I think the regulator, you know, and a regulator is perfectly correct to look at that. Where I think it gets even more interesting and important for the regulator is our regulators regulate us as an industry strictly, but they also give us a lot of responsibility to be policing ourselves and to be monitoring what it is that we're doing and to have that culture in place to make sure that we're doing what it is that we're supposed to be doing. And when you have a breakdown like happened there, it is more than appropriate for a regulator to become involved and figure out not only what was the underlying conduct, but what failed and who failed to allow something like this to happen. And the regulator, in my view, looks at that as a breach of the trust that the regulator puts in the licensed entity to be policing itself, which is why we come back around, you need that culture of compliance. You know, we have a similar mandate here that Ilka mentioned in terms of the scope and duties of responsibility of our compliance committee and our compliance staff to look at essentially anything that can create a problem for the organization from a compliance perspective. And it's something we take very seriously. So when you see a situation like litigation took place and there was a failure to disclose it and it was material and it was settled, and it certainly appears that was not an administrative oversight, you have to ask what happened. And I think the answer to that question is there's a failure of the culture, or there's a failure of sufficient checkpoints in the system to make sure that if one person isn't disclosing something, someone else is aware of that and makes the determination to disclose it, or at least has a conversation about, is this something that's required to be disclosed, or is it not material, et cetera. I think you've got to have, in a good compliance program, you've got to have those multiple trails. You've got to have oversight where someone else is checking what's going on, so that one person acting alone doesn't make a decision, like perhaps, the decision to not disclose the litigation that was being settled in the Wynn scenario. If that one person could have just been making an error in judgment, or could have made a decision not to, or whatever, that there's appropriate review of those kinds of decisions taking place to make sure that if that's the right decision, everyone's satisfied that it is the right decision. More often than not, in a circumstance like that, it's the wrong decision, and you need someone else to step in and say, this is the wrong decision and we need to fix it. So I think any good compliance program has to have those multiple layers of reporting, multiple avenues of oversight, a really well-engaged compliance committee that asks lots of questions, that holds its compliance staff to account and requires those questions be satisfactorily answered. And then you layer on top of that a very good, open, communicative relationship with regulators. I always say, when things are going well, you communicate with your regulator a lot. And when you have a problem, you communicate with your regulator even more, because keeping your regulator informed is part of that relationship of trust that you have with your regulator. And so when a regulator has to find out something like that from some other source, not only does everyone look bad, but it immediately raises the question of, where is there a problem in the system here, and why did this fall apart?
Yeah, it's such a good point. I think everyone will remember Enron, and I remember that I got hired by a huge military defense firm because they wanted to know, why did the whistleblowers in Enron not just report that to Enron? Why did they go to the government? Or why do whistleblowers ever go outside the organization? And, we studied 200 whistleblower cases and interviewed the whistleblowers in those cases. And you and Elkim and Michael won't be surprised to learn that our conclusion was that whistleblowers often don't believe that if they report internally, their concerns are going to be taken seriously when they're in an organization where compliance is not part of the culture. When you roll out serious compliance plans throughout your organizations, people that feel like they're part of a team on compliance are much more comfortable and much more likely to report that internally. And what Chris just said is super important, because obviously if you can create that culture of compliance and people are reporting internally, it allows you to manage that a lot better when you're sharing it with a regulator over that whistleblower feeling like, there's no culture of compliance here, this is going to be swept under the carpet, I might as well just go straight to the regulator, the prosecutor, whoever. So those are super, super important points. And Vivian, I want to move to the next slide because it's a good transition into our next topic. And Chris, just to come back to you and then go back to Elkim and Michael one after the other. We have about 15 minutes left. Where does compliance fit in a gaming company? I mean, I see that your VP, Chief Compliance Officer. It'd be interesting just to understand who you report to, and is it a legal function, or are you reporting to a board, and Elkim and Michael, same question.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different ways that companies organize their compliance function, and I don't know that one is necessarily better than the other. Our compliance function at Penn is organized where the Chief Compliance Officer reports to both the General Counsel and to the Compliance Committee. So, and our Compliance Committee consists of 2 independent members of our board of directors, and then an outside consultant not affiliated with the company who serves on the compliance committee. So I think having both an internal and then an independent report is a good way to organize things, because it keeps us well within the company, but also has those levels of independence in the event. And and I hope that this would never have to happen, but if it ever did, and I needed to bring something separately to the attention of the compliance committee, have absolutely no qualms or hesitation about doing that. And so then I think knowing that the Chief Compliance Officer has those multiple abilities to report instills in the people who report to me, either directly or on a dotted line, the confidence that if they do feel the need to report something to me, that it will be taken seriously and looked at in an independent manner consistent with the culture of the company and with our compliance plan. Jeff, you mentioned an interesting thing about, whistleblowers. I think we have a very robust system here for anonymous reporting. It's certainly utilized, and I'm sure most gaming companies have similar things. And I think compliance needs to take a close look at those kinds of reports and make sure that people within the organization know that compliance is empowered to do what it needs to do to investigate, to remedy any issues that are found without any fear of retaliation, and that compliance has those independent checks in place and has the confidence of everyone in the organization. I think that, like I said, our structure, I think, really promotes that. I have seen other structures that I think promote it just as well.
Thank you. Elcom?
Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, I'll echo a lot of what Chris just said as well. I think there are multiple ways of doing this, and one isn't a magical solution to this. I think a lot of it is dependent on the company's geographical footprint and the company's historical rationale for growing the way it did, whether the company is a public company or not. A whole number of factors figure into it. In our organization, I actually, having just joined a few months ago, right before COVID became what became, we had talked about my taking a look at how we do things and how we've done things at Hard Rock traditionally, and how we should do things going forward to perhaps enhance and update how we've done things historically. And I'm actually literally in the process of doing that now, with a lot of input from a lot of very smart folks, obviously. And what we have in place right now is the corporate compliance function does report up to me, and we have a compliance committee at the corporate level, and that compliance committee meets once quarterly, and we have that overarching mandate, or the compliance committee has that overarching mandate to look at anything that impacts on, or that may impact adversely on, the reputation of the company. We call that an unsuitable situation. And we also have the obviously added nuance of being both, just like Penn, being both in the online space and the bricks and mortar space. And on top of that, we happen to also have this interesting nuance. It doesn't necessarily fall directly into this mandate per se, but it does in a broader way figure into the culture and the concept of compliance. We have all these other business verticals, these business lines, as you probably know. We're in the hospitality industry. We're in 76 countries. And so we have a lot of cafes, restaurants, hotels, and some JVs across the planet. And that makes things obviously very interesting, dealing with multiple jurisdictions, and how those businesses get impacted by adverse reputational or other impacts are critically important to how we run the business, obviously, and how it impacts not just on licensing, but per se, but reputation, the brand, the value of the brand. So all of it coalesces into the need to deal with it appropriately and holistically. So we're in the middle of looking at exactly how perhaps we may want to enhance what we do today. But being in the role now for 6 months, I do see certainly that it is part of the very DNA of this organization, and we do take this very seriously, like Penn does and other robust organizations do. And I think the challenges of technology and the speed with which things change with respect to technology, and how regulators and operators strive to keep up with that change, I think is going to figure into how we ought to deal with compliance and licensing and related matters in the future as well. So it's a big task to try to, I think, coalesce all that into a function that makes sense for the organization in today's day and age that's constantly evolving. But I'll echo every single sentiment that Chris just made. I think it's critical that we handle it, but I think it's also critically important that it be handled holistically, that every input needs to connect, the dots have to connect, the glue has to be there. Otherwise, if the if the compliance culture isn't there, it doesn't ultimately serve the company. It's not if the trust isn't there, if the credibility and gravitas aren't there, it's not good for the enterprise going forward. And so we do have that as part of our DNA, and we intend to enhance it even further.
Excellent, Michael. Where does Catena stand on the issue of compliance and where it fits and who you report to?
Sure. So Catena is in an earlier part of the journey in some ways in terms of organizational structure of compliance. But I think the nice thing about Catena is it was in our DNA. So we pride ourselves very much on being, in the online world, they talk a lot, particularly all worlds, but the white, the gray, the black. Catena has always been a white organization. In the places that we do business would have to have clear regulations around online gaming and affiliation. So we already had that, even though we didn't really have a structure of a full compliance group within the organization. And that's been growing rapidly as we've entered the US and as other regulations have happened overseas. So it's how you have that structure. So our compliance team, I'm not in the compliance team, I run the commercials or what have you. But our compliance reports into our general counsel. And they continue to work on how that's going to structure. In the case of like Chris talked about, how does the compliance committee work within the board? Because I'm a big believer in myself in having that dual reporting because, I can't remember the exact Latin phrase, but there's the translation thereof, which was who will guard the guards themselves. So if you don't have that dual way of having a compliance report, then you don't have true independence because there's always somebody who can game the system, so to speak. Not saying that people would, but that is the nature of the risk. So yeah, Catena is moving forward and we're growing our compliance group and figuring out how does that fit in the greater organization and how does that formalize from some of the philosophies the company has into actual practices and creating doctrine around marketing practices that cover what is going on in the jurisdictions versus just having these things be ingrained in the people and this is how we should behave. Now it has to be a little more formal.
Well, thank you. Let's go to the last slide, and we've got some questions coming in that I'm reviewing. Vivian, if you could just go to the last slide. We talked about this a little bit at the top, but anytime you design a compliance plan, you have to take into effect the risks because it's a very risk-based approach. And given the time that's remaining, I just want to review the comments that have been made in answering that question and then go to our last page. But in designing a compliance plan, every organization should really take into account the risks that exist in their organization. And when it comes to gaming, what we've heard Michael and Ilkam and Chris say is that there are issues around technology, there are issues around data security, there are issues around payment processing, there are issues around age, there's issues around geolocation, AML requirements. All of these things that we heard all of our experts talk about, those are all risks that are in the industry. So a compliance plan is going to be expected to have a plan that effectively mitigates those risks some way. And then that plan also has to be audited. And part of a traditional compliance plan is also to have someone like Chris, who is a compliance officer for the organization, who is testing the strength of the compliance plan. Because I think everyone would agree, the worst thing about worse than having no compliance plan is having a compliance plan that's not implemented or doesn't really work and is not really applied in an organization. Now, one of the things that we saw overseas have been a history of issues in the UK that have been recently in the media around issues like payment processing, use of credit cards, problem gaming, responsible gaming. And it's very confusing over here because Michael, we look at the UK and we think, well, that, like you said, that's Europe and that's where the European operators have been operating for so long. One would think from an American's perspective that if they've been operating for so long and we just finished talking about all these rigorous compliance plans, how are we dealing with this? How are we now seeing the results of things like, problem gaming and credit card problems, advertising and promotion issues, which are exaggerated or deceptive? how did all that happen, and why is it happening over there now? And what's our lesson from that?
So Jeff, I think Europe, and having spent some time working in Europe and working for other European companies as they came this way, Europe was a bit of the wild, wild west in terms of the regulatory landscape. There were lots of white and gray markets and very undefined things. The regulators had allowed for very open interpretations, and you know, in the Adam Smith nature of people, self-interest got a hold of it, and it went to the extremes where there were affiliates, there were media companies, there were operators who were pushing too far. And so at some point, the people spoke and the regulators listened, and the pendulum swung. And it may have swung too far, but there was a correction that was necessary. To me, the US is in a much better place because we've already have ingrained in us and regulation and a group that oversees in a regulatory fashion what we do from a compliance and manages this. And so there are checks and balances from day one. So that allows for a faster and better growing market in many ways because the playbook is already defined. It's not changing rapidly. I mean, New Jersey started very strict on a lot of its compliance to the online space and has eased up on some of that as they've seen how some of this can be self-regulated and self-policed, but it's still very clear in its guidelines. And so we're able to function as a business because things are not rapidly changing like they are now in Europe, but yet the people are protected. So that's probably my view on how what went wrong there versus what's going to happen well here.
Yeah, it's, you know, when you speak with the regulators, I get a sense, Ilkham and Chris, if you can comment in the closing comments on this. I mean, I get a sense that, you know, the regulators are very, very focused on ensuring that there are no issues and no cases that are going to give anyone, you know, fodder to talk about and gossip about and complain about. Very focused regulators in New Jersey and Pennsylvania on ensuring no underage gaming, that gaming is confined to the borders of their state, that there's no AML fraud concerns, that we don't have the issue of little Jenny using her credit card, her mother's credit card to gamble online, underage, you know, from New York. Are you feeling the same thing, Chris?
Yeah, and absolutely. We're aligned with our regulators and everyone else on this. We don't want any of that happening either. We take RG issues and the like incredibly seriously. They're a part of our compliance plan. They're a part of our culture. We work with our regulators to make sure that we're as proactive as we can possibly be about these issues because we understand how critical they are. You know, you hear about the headlines, and obviously nobody wants the headlines, but if you look at the underlying activity, nobody wants the underlying activity either. It's not just the bad press. It's culturally, we don't want to be an organization that does not take responsible gaming issues and the like seriously. And so I think working proactively with our regulators is really the way to go. And I think regulators in the US appreciate when operators work proactively with them and are willing to make it a two-way street to keep the dialogue open and to be combating these issues in real time.
And Ilkham, just kind of giving a nod to tomorrow's panel, which is on responsible gaming and problem gaming. It has participants from both the Pennsylvania board as well as the National Council on Problem Gaming, as well as General Counsel and from White Hat. And as I mentioned, Jeremy Kleiman. I hope everyone can tune in for that tomorrow at noon. Just as we hit the top of our hour, Ilkham, as a last point, how does problem, I mean, Chris just mentioned problem gaming fitting into compliance. Like, how is problem gaming a compliance issue?
Well, I think consistent with what we've talked about in the last hour, it becomes part of the very concepts that define how you operate as a responsible company. It's almost like a corporate responsibility, being a good corporate citizen issue. It goes to the very the very fabric of how you do things, the very culture of how you do things. None of us want to take, obviously, advantage of vulnerable folks who may have gaming issues or gambling issues, problem gambling issues. We take it extremely seriously on first principles. It's to Chris's point, it's not only a reputational thing. It's not just a regulatory thing. It's a cultural thing. We don't want it. It's not the right thing. It is the wrong thing to ignore or avoid. It doesn't make you a good corporate citizen. It doesn't make you a good contributor to the industry, a good entity in your local community as a driver of business, as a driver of employment development and deployment of capital and investment. It's generally something that is, I think, on first principles ought to be avoided by everyone. But certainly for us, we take it incredibly seriously. It bubbles up the chain again, percolates rather up the chain to being a compliance issue, because it's either regulated in some way, fashion, or form in whatever jurisdiction we're in on just the very basic nature of regulation. It may be regulated, or it goes into this concept of falling into a trap of finding yourself in an unsuitable situation, an undesirable situation that impacts on the reputation and integrity of the business. It's not good for you. It's not good for your employees. It's not good for your patrons. It's not good for your guests. Not good for your community that depend on you as a good corporate citizen to operate responsibly, to be a leader in the industry, to be a leader within your own, not only geographical footprint, but within the industry that you operate broadly, wherever that may be. It's the part of culture that needs to be adopted for success, as far as I'm concerned, Jeff.
Well, speaking of leadership, we are so lucky and privileged to have you, Ilkam, and Michael and Chris, who you're all leaders in your organizations and really in this this young online industry that is emerging. All of your names and all of your organizations come across our desk all the time, and we're super appreciate taking time out of your day to share thoughts on corporate compliance and culture of compliance and all of the expert issues that you've shared with us. I also want to thank GeoComply. GeoComply obviously is the expert and somewhat of the Lone Ranger in the geocompliance space, and is really the number one provider and supplier of geolocation services. Tomorrow, as I mentioned, our group led by Jeremy, my co-founder, is going to be leading a seminar on responsible gaming as a business strategy. Please check out Idea Growth's responsible gaming principles, which are on the Idea Growth website and reflect a lot of what Ilkam just said. So Michael, Ilkam, and Chris, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for listening. And please keep in mind this session is being recorded. And if you've missed it or a colleague has missed it, you can receive a link. And any questions about Idea, please contact our director, Amy, at ideagrowth.org. Thank you again, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff.